The Holy Gospel according to Mark, the 7th chapter. From there, Jesus set out and went away to the region of Tyre. He entered a house and did not want anyone to know he was there, yet he could not escape notice. But a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit immediately heard about him, and she came and bowed down at his feet. Now the woman was a Gentile of Syrophoenician origin. She begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter. He said to her, "Let the children be fed first, for it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." But she answered him, "Sir, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." Then he said to her, "For saying that, you may go. The demon has left your daughter." So she went home, found the child laying on the bed, and the demon gone. Then Jesus returned from the region of Tyre and went by way of Sidon towards the Sea of Galilee in the region of the Decapolis. They brought to him a deaf man who had an impediment in his speech, and they begged him to lay his hand on him. He took him aside in private, away from the crowd, and put his fingers into his ears, and he spat and touched his tongue. Then looking up to heaven, he sighed and said to him, "Ephphatha," that is, "be opened." And immediately his ears were opened, his tongue was released, and he spoke plainly. Then Jesus ordered them to tell no one. But the more he ordered them, the more zealously they proclaimed it. They were astounded beyond measure, saying, "He has done everything well. He even makes the deaf to hear and the mute to speak." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
You may be seated. Yesterday, I had the distinct privilege of meeting with the third graders and their families. And as we met, we handed those third graders brand new Bibles. And then we handed them a dry highlighter. And over the course of the next period of time, those third graders and their families and I read through a variety of scripture texts together. And we invited those third graders to highlight those verses in their Bibles. And we invited them to talk with their families about what was going on in those lessons. So we read lessons about baptism, about how we are joined to Christ not only in a death like his, but in a resurrection like his, and that is our hope. We read about communion. We read those words of institution that we hear every Sunday. We read that wonderful portion of Romans that talks about how we are made right with God, not by anything that we do, but by what God has done. And we highlighted them. We read the 10 Commandments and found out that they're actually in the Bible. And we read the Lord's Prayer and learned that it's in the Bible. And we read the very beginning of the very first book of the Bible. In the beginning, God created. And we highlighted that. And then we went to the first chapter of John's Gospel, where John starts laying out that image that indeed Jesus is the new creation. You know those words. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And we highlighted those. And we highlighted John 3:16, and we remembered that God's love is so big that it is for everyone, even for those who would so easily reject God. And then we took a minute and we asked those family members who were with their young ones to remember and identify their favorite scripture reading, their favorite text. And I invited those parents and grandparents and baptismal sponsors to find their favorite lesson in the Bible in their child's Bible and highlight that lesson, that scripture, and then in the margins to write a blessing to their child. So that as their child continues to use that Bible over the years, as they come across those places where those blessings are written, they will remember. One parent even put the date there, so we can remember that there was a specific time that we received that blessing, and it keeps coming back to us. My prayer is that those children will then go to other family members and baptismal sponsors and other important adults in their lives with those Bibles and ask them to highlight their favorite scripture and write a blessing for them. So that that book that we give becomes a gift of blessings that they can carry with them throughout their lives. In many ways, for those 3-year-old Somebody told me before worship, I'm tired. I guess I'm tired too. For those third graders, with apologies, guys, all right? For those third graders, this is a new beginning, a new kind of relationship with the story of God. And today is also, as we have talked about, Rally Day, a day of new beginnings for our parish education, not just for those young ones age 3 on up through high school, but also for all of us. There are opportunities. So we as adults can gather and hear God's story for us, but not just on Sunday mornings. There's also Bible study opportunities throughout the week. This is a time when we mark new beginnings in the way that we engage and encounter God's story for us. And in the midst of this, we as a staff have been talking about a variety of principles that we have received that have been kind of the result of research that has been going on over the past 30 years. And out of that comes a sense that there are some 4 key faith practices that families can engage in their home, that each of us can engage in our daily life. The first practice is the practice of having trusted companions for our children, that they have trusted adults, parents and grandparents and aunts and uncles to be sure, but other adults outside the family, faithful people with whom they can have caring conversations about what's going on in their life. And in the midst of those conversations, they have an opportunity to explore where God is in the midst of that. To ask the question of, what is God doing in the midst of what's going on in our lives? But beyond that, another practice that has been raised up is the practice of devotions, reading Scripture as a family together, and listening for what God is speaking to us and how that intersects with our story, so that God's story and our story find a place of connection. A third practice that has been identified as being practices that help our children grow in faith, and indeed help all of us grow in faith, is when families intentionally name Jesus Christ as they go out and serve others. So Christian service together as a family speaks volumes to our youngest ones about who we are called to be. And finally, rituals and traditions. We all have our traditions. We all know what we're supposed to have for Christmas dinner or Thanksgiving dinner or Easter dinner. We all know what we're supposed to do before the big events in our lives. The question is, how do those things, those rituals and traditions, speak our faith to our young ones? I heard this wonderful story this past week, a story of a friend of mine who is in the practice of each night as she says goodnight to her young daughter, she makes the sign of the cross, the sign of the cross that was marked on her daughter at her baptism, and she says, "You are a beloved child of God." And as they went through that practice, all of a sudden one night, her daughter reached up and made the sign of the cross on her forehead and said, "You are a beloved grown-up of God." The research suggests that we don't teach faith. Faith is not taught, but it is caught. It is something that when our young ones swim in that water, when it's part of our atmosphere enough, then over time they start to catch it. It sticks to them. It becomes part of their daily life and how they function. It becomes what they do because it's what we do. We've all heard the story of the parent who's driving down the road and all of a sudden hears at least one piece of profanity come out of their young one's mouth. And the parent all of a sudden gets a glimpse of what their child is catching in the environment. The question that I want to ask today is, what is it that our children are catching, and what practices are we putting into place as a community and as families of God to help enrich that environment? Today in our gospel reading, we hear about this man whose ears are stopped up. He cannot hear. He is deaf. His mouth is tied. He is mute. He cannot speak. And does he go to Jesus? No. His friends take him to Jesus and beg Jesus to heal him. His friends bring him to Jesus. And as they beg, Jesus takes him off to the side, and Jesus puts his fingers in his ears, spits and touches his tongue, and then he sighs. Ephatha, be opened. And immediately he can hear, immediately he can speak clearly. Everything is new. His story and Jesus' story, the story of God, intersect, they collide, and his life changes dramatically. What I want to ask you to do is to think about your life right now. Take just a moment and ponder where you are in your life. What Bible story comes to your mind that intersects, that speaks to where you are in your walk? The more we practice listening for and identifying God, and the ways that God's story intersects with our story, the easier it becomes to recognize God's presence in our lives. But what's more than that, I believe that when we encounter God in that kind of a way, then we, like that blind and deaf man and his friends, we can't help but tell the story. We can't help but share the good news. We can't help but tell others. And the more we practice it, the better we get at it. And the better we get at it, the more our environment becomes enriched by awareness of God and God's love in our midst. Did you hear those last phrases? When the people heard the deaf man's story, they were astounded beyond measure. They said, Jesus has done everything well. He even makes the deaf hear and the mute to speak. Now, from Isaiah and from other stories in the Bible, the people knew when they saw that kind of thing happen, they were in the presence of God. They didn't need anybody to tell them that. They knew it because they knew the story. Their story and God's story intersected, and they recognized what was going on in their midst. And so, let us practice our faith in such a way that we too can recognize how God's story and our story connect. But more so, that we may be bold in sharing our story so that others may be astounded beyond measure